I want to add authentication support to our Strawberry Shake GraphQL client application. And the reason I want to do that is because various mutations on our Hot Chocolate GraphQL server now require authentication. So for example, if I look at our API and go to our schema and our mutations and look at this, we have this create course mutation, and this requires the user to be authenticated. So on our GraphQL server, the way we've implemented authentication is with Firebase. So that being said, what we're going to have to do on the client side is first get credentials from the user, and then we're going to send those credentials to the Firebase Authentication server, and we're going to get back an access token. And then when we execute the request to create a course or do any of these mutations, we are going to want to send up that access token, and our server is going to validate that access token, authenticate the user, and then execute the mutation. So first step here, we're going to have to integrate those Firebase authentication flows into our client application so that we can get an access token. So to do that, there actually is a helper package that exists. So if we go to manage NuGet packages for our client, and then we just search for Firebase Authentication.net, it's this first result here by Step Up Labs. So we can install that, and now we'll be able to use this package to get Firebase authentication tokens that we can use to authenticate with our GraphQL API. So there's going to be a lot of authentication and client application setup that I want to do here, but this is a GraphQL series on Strawberry Shake, so the first thing I'm going to do is show how we can automatically send our access token up to our GraphQL server. So if we head into our program.cs for our client application, what we can do is we can configure our HTTP client here to add our access token to the request automatically. So if we open this up, we're going to have to have some blocks here because we're going to do a few things here. Not only are we going to set the base address, which ultimately points us to our GraphQL server, but we're also going to set some default request headers for our HTTP client. And the header that we want to set is the authorization header. So let's set that, and that's going to be a new authentication header value. So let me just import that. And the scheme we want here is bearer because we're using bearer token authentication. And then the second parameter that we set here is actually called parameter, and this is going to be the actual token that our server uses to authenticate our user. And ultimately, I want to store our bearer token somewhere in our application, but for now I'm just going to hard code it here, so I'll fill this in a second. But the next thing I want to do is actually make the request that's going to require authentication. So that's going to be a script, just like how I have this get courses script that executes the get courses query. We're going to have another script, and this is going to be called the create course script, because our create course mutation requires authentication. So we're going to need our GraphQL demo client in here. So let me just copy that from our other script and paste it in here and update the constructor. So this client's going to get injected in. And again, this is just the generated client that we use to execute our queries and mutations and other GraphQL operations. So I'm also going to have to register this script in dependency injection so that we can resolve that. So let me add the create course script right there. And now when our application starts, I actually want to execute this create course script instead. So instead of injecting our get courses script in our startup and running that, I'm going to do our create course script instead. And I'm going to rename this to just script, just to keep it more generic. And in the future, I'm going to hook all of these scripts up to console keys and have some kind of menu logic right here. But for now, I'm just going to keep it simple so that we can demo the GraphQL stuff. And now we are going to want to run this create course script. So let me add a run method here. So just an async method. So just going to return a task, no actual return value here. And we want to run this script. And now I just want to execute our mutation. So let's take our GraphQL demo client and we're going to execute our create course mutation. So let's execute that async. And this takes a course input parameter that has the data for the course that we want to create. So let's generate that variable and initialize that right here. So the name of the course is just going to be algebra. The subject, of course, is going to be mathematics. And I need an instructor ID. I actually don't know any instructor IDs off the top of my head. So let me actually query an existing course. I think I can just execute this one. And here we go. I'll just grab this instructor ID right here and then set that as the instructor ID on this new course. So I can do a GUID.parse and pass in the instructor ID that I just got from that query, and this instructor should exist. And then we also want to get the result from this mutation, so the create course result. And the reason I really want this result right now is because I want to look at this create course result, which has errors on it, and I want to actually see the errors that we get back, and we should be able to see that authentication error. And last thing I want to do before I run this is I do want to mention that we do have our GraphQL server with hot chocolate running in the background right now. So obviously this is important so that our client has a server to connect to. So make sure you have that running. But what are we waiting for? Let's try this out. And we should see the authentication error in this errors object. So let's look at that. And there we go. We got one error in here and we get the authentication error. So now what I want to do is actually get an access token and then paste it in here, just hard code it for now. So if I head into Postman, I'm going to manually hit the Firebase API to sign in with password. And I provided this email and password for a user that I've already created. And I also provide the API key for my Firebase project. And if you're wondering where to find this API key, what you do in the Firebase console is you go to project settings and the web API key is just right here. So this is what you would use. And for all this Firebase authentication setup, I talk about this more on the hot chocolate video where we add Firebase authentication to the GraphQL server. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in more of this. But for now, I just want to generate the access token. And again, this user already exists. So let's send this up. And here we go. We get an ID token back. So let me copy this. So take that token, head back into our GraphQL client and just hard code this in here for now. So there we go. Looks good. And then I'm going to put a breakpoint right here to show that this does get executed right before we execute our mutation. So let me put a breakpoint here as well. And let's run this. So here we go, getting ready to execute the mutation. Let's continue. We set the authentication header value to our bearer access token for Firebase. And then we continue and we get our result. And this time we have no errors. And if we look at the data, our course was created and we get the ID of the created course. So this pretty much shows off how you can integrate authentication with Strawberry Shake. All you have to do is really set this authorization header. But next up, what I want to do is actually integrate authentication with our application. And what I mean is I don't want to hard code an access token right here. What I want to do is actually get the user's credentials, send those credentials up to Firebase, get an access token back, and then use that access token to hit our GraphQL API, and in this case, create the course and pass authentication on the server side. So the first thing we're going to do is get credentials from the user. So another script I want to add is a login script. And I think all I'm going to do is handle login here, and registration we might handle down the road. But I really just want to show off how we can get an access token, store it somewhere, and then send it up to our server. So this is going to be the login script. We're going to have a method to run the script, and it's not going to return anything. And now this login script is where we're finally going to use our Firebase Authentication.net package that we installed earlier. I don't know why I installed that so early because we're not using it until now. So everything I did before this, you did not need that package, but now we need it. So that package includes a Firebase Auth provider, and we want to get that injected into the script. So the Firebase Auth provider, import that from firebase.auth, and let's generate a constructor that gets that injected in. And this auth provider has our sign-in method. So if we take this Firebase Auth provider, we can use sign-in with email and password async. So we want to do that. And here we just pass in the user's email and password. So let's get these into variables. So email and password, and now let's just get them from the user. So the email we're going to get from a console read line, and password we're also going to get from a console read line. And let's just add some prompts as well. So we'll say enter your email and enter your password. And then we're going to take that email and password, sign in, and this gives us back a Firebase Auth link. So let's take that, the Firebase Auth link. And this Firebase Auth link has the Firebase token, which we're going to use to send up to our GraphQL server and get authenticated. So that being said, we have finished the first two steps that we had talked about. We've gotten the user's credentials, and we've sent those credentials up to the Firebase Authentication server to get an access token back. So now we just need to store that token somewhere so that we can use it when we execute requests with our HTTP client. So I want to store this token in a singleton object that I can also access when we configure our HTTP client. So that's going to be a store because it's going to store our token state. So let me add a new folder for stores, and I'm just going to call this the token store. And for now, just to keep things simple, this token store is just going to have a single property for our access token. So what I mean by keeping things simple is that we are not going to be storing refresh tokens or expiration times in order to support automatic token refreshing. But aside from that, I want to store this Firebase token in our token store. So let's get that token store injected into our login script. So this is going to be the token store, import that, and let's get that injected through our constructor. And now let's just take our token store and set the access token to our Firebase token. And then we'll say something like successfully logged in. And again, just to keep things simple, not doing any error handling here, although that's definitely something we should do because they might have provided the wrong credentials, and in that case we would get an error. But I just want to focus on getting through the flow and demonstrating the core functionality. So now that we're storing our access token, we can use it when we execute GraphQL requests. So in this configure HTTP client method, there's an overload to what we can pass in here, and this overload gives us a service provider. So I'll just call this services, and as we see, this is a service provider. So we can use this service provider to resolve our token store. So let's get our token store right here using our service provider. So we're going to resolve the token store. Let me import that. And this token store has our access token. So no longer need to hard code that here. Let's get rid of this. It is super long. Oh, this is hard. Okay. All right, here we go. So passing in our access token that we stored on the token store. So it should be good here. Let me put a breakpoint for when we test this. I think all we have to do now is register everything in dependency injection. So first off, let's register our login script, and we can register that as transient. And I want to register this because I want to use it in our startup class. So let's actually get the login script injected through the constructor. So add that as a parameter to our constructor. And now I want to run this script before we run our create core script to ensure that we are logged in. So let's take that and run it. And now that we have multiple scripts, I feel like I should rename this to create core script, even though I feel like we just renamed it to just plain old script. But just going to do that real quick. And now that our login script is registered, this depends on our token store and our Firebase auth provider as well. So we need to register both of these dependencies. So token store, pretty easy to register because it doesn't depend on anything else. But most importantly, this needs to be a singleton. And we want it as a singleton because we want to use the same token store instance right here when we configure our HTTP client and in our login script. And the reason why I want that is because the token store stores our Firebase access token. So if we have multiple instances, then the access token that we set on this token store instance wouldn't be set on this token store instance that we use to hit our GraphQL server. So that's going to have to be a singleton. And then lastly, we need our Firebase auth provider as well. And that can just be a singleton as well. And in fact, we're just going to instantiate it right here. So the Firebase auth provider. So import that from Firebase auth. And that requires a Firebase config. So let's instantiate one of those. And all this requires is an API key. So again, in our Firebase project, in these project settings, the API key that we want is this one right here, the web API key. So let's copy that and let's use that in our app. We could actually paste in the API key right here as a raw string because the API key isn't sensitive or something that needs to be kept confidential. But instead, I'm going to put it into our app settings.json that we have. So I'm just going to add another key here for the Firebase API key and just paste in our key right here, and then I can just get the API key right here. So Firebase API key, and get that from the host builder context configuration, and I want to get a value, and this will give us back a value from our app settings.json. In our case, it's a string for our API key, and the key that we have for this value is the Firebase API key. So let's just use that down here and we should be good to go. So let me add some more breakpoints here to test this out. So my email, singletonsean@gmail.com. My password, I think it's just test123. Let me check. Yup, here we go. That's the password I used before to generate an access token. So let's do this. And looks like our sign in was successful. So we got our Firebase token back. So let's wrap up this login script, continue, and now getting ready to execute our create course mutation. So let's do that. And before we send that request, we set this authorization header, and looks like we have our access token in our token store. So that header is going to be set correctly. Let's continue again, and we got our result back. Let's see. We have no errors, that's great, and it looks like our course was created, and we have the ID of the created course. So that sums up all the authentication functionality I wanted to implement here. We're going to improve this application down the road and flesh it out a lot more, but demonstrating the core authentication functionality, what we did was we configured our HTTP client for Strawberry Shake to send up, in this case, a Firebase access token, but this would really work with any authentication scheme that relies on an authorization header as well. But this was really the core behavior I wanted to show off. Everything else was related to improving our application. So we added this login script to actually get credentials from the user and log them in. And then we added the token store that handles our access token state and gives us a place where we can store our access token, which we later use to set the authorization header on our request to our GraphQL server. So hopefully you can use this to authenticate against GraphQL servers from your GraphQL client application. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.